Hello everybody, this is Naz. With the school year over, I figured it was time to revisit one of my other video series here. This is Esports Economist. The idea is to bring you guys focus on some other content beyond just statistics and possibly beyond just Dota 2. This is not the video that I thought I was going to be making tonight. I had some plans to record a TI qualifiers vid for you guys. But Valve posted a major announcement this afternoon, and I wanted to weigh in with some of my thoughts. The content of this announcement was that for the next year, so starting beyond TI7, we are going to have a major change to the way the Dota 2 professional scene is going to be run, especially at the top end. The era of Valve-run majors is over. There are now going to be two tiers of tournaments, labeled both majors and minors by Valve, and no longer will there be a flat $3 million prize pool for Valve run events. Instead, Valve is going to be partnering with third-party tournament organizers. The idea is that majors, qualified major tournaments, are going to be minimum $500,000 prize pool events, and Valve is going to contribute an additional $500,000 on top. Minors are going to be minimum $150,000 of events with an additional $150,000 provided by Valve. So expect that $300,000 and $1 million are going to be the two most common prize pools. Just doing the math, one would also expect that there are probably going to be more frequent events. So instead of just the two or three $3 million majors, you might see as many as 4 or 5 $1 million majors, and hopefully supported by a number of smaller tournaments as well. There's not much specifically spelled out in this additional blog entry, but there are some requirements given. Valve has stipulated in its initial post that both types of tournaments must have, number one, at least one qualifier from each of the 6 regions. So North America, South America, SEA, China, EU, and CIS all have to be represented with at least one qualifier slot each. There is no stipulation on the format of these qualifiers, so they can be run in several different ways. We'll get back to that later. It's also stipulated that any tournament for which Valve is going to match for the prize pool like this has to have a LAN finals component, so at least the final matches have to be played on LAN. And again, there's no specified format for this either. So what I'm hoping is we might get a little bit more variety in some of the tournaments that we've seen. But again, we'll get to see this later. The big change, other than Valve matching the prize pool instead of providing 3 million flat, is going to be qualifying points. So rather than invites to Valve run majors being decided rather arbitrarily, we are going to have a running tally of qualifying points being awarded throughout the year that are going to contribute to a team earning its way into TI. What is said in the blog is that majors are going to provide more prize points, not only more points, but more points per prize pool dollar. So there is going to be a non-linear scaling. Majors have to have at least just over 3 times the minimum prize pool, but they could be worth, say, 5 times or more the points compared to minors. This is probably a good thing. We all want the biggest tournaments to have the most impact in deciding bids to the international. The other major thing that was spelled out is that points are going to accrue to individual players, not teams. So roster lock periods are still going to occur, but the difference is that players that change teams during one of these roster lock periods will keep the points that they have earned by placing or winning at previous tournaments. So there's now hopefully going to be a lot more mobility. Now, one of the things that we'll talk about as we go on that was not spelled out is what the penalty is going to be for violating the roster lock period. So if you do have a roster change outside of the lock period, is it just that player that loses his qualifying points? Is the entire team penalized in terms of its qualifying points or its eligibility to participate in the different events? The other thing is, it is suggested, if you read the blog, that these qualifying points are going to count for TI only. It is not spelled out whether individual qualifying points or team qualifying points will have an influence in determining the identity of teams competing at the next major. So things are going to be a lot less immediate. It's going to be a much more long-term process, at least ostensibly, where we're going to see teams earning points throughout the year trying to get into TI instead of just this crazy bout of lands having a huge influence only on the bids to the next major. That's going to be nice. It's going to give us a little bit more continuity. There are some concerns, though, that I have that we'll talk about going on. So why this change? This is something, if you're not familiar with Dota 2, if you're coming from the outside of the scene looking in, this is something that a lot of us that follow the scene have really asked for, have pushed for in the last couple seasons. And I think the overarching reaction today, there's still a lot of uncertainty, but the overarching reaction today for most people that follow Dota 2 is a great deal of satisfaction. We're very optimistic about this new system. The fact is, Valve Run major tournaments have just dominated the landscape for the last 2 years since TI5, when the major system was first introduced. You can see I've pulled, this is data mostly from Liquipedia on premium and professional tab tournaments. So again, there's no hard prize pool cutoffs for premium and professional, and in fact, we'll actually look at a little bit different ways of defining these events as we go on, but these are tournaments that were advertised as premium or professional tournaments in the client, and you can see both the frequency, the big fall off in terms of the frequency of these events after TI5. We went from 55 and 49 to only 40 and 37 in the last couple of years between TIs. As well as, this is something that was a little concerning, the actual average prize pool declined for the non-Valve events post TI6 compared to TI5 to TI6. Now, this is there's a little bit of subjectivity that I used in making these plots. I excluded DAC 2015 with its nearly $3 million prize pool. That was kind of viewed, at least after the fact, it was kind of viewed as the prototype for the majors. It was viewed as, technically it wasn't a Valve run event, but it was Perfect World, and Valve had a great deal of say. So I think a lot of people group that as sort of a pre-major. I've also excluded WESG, which was a little bit of a different, it was a $1.5 million tournament held this past winter. It was a little bit different because of its format. Only teams that had 5 players of the same nationality were allowed to compete. So it was a very, very different event. I think a lot of people viewed it as being outside the standard Dota 2 professional scene, and so I've chosen to eliminate it from these graphs, just for full disclosure. We have seen a few non-major super events. So the $500,000 tournaments that Valve is talking about that they want to match prize pool for, these already sort of exist, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail on the next slide. Some of them have been very, very good. So the two Epicenters, both Epicenter events, have been absolutely outstanding, both last year and this year, and those are around a $500,000 prize pool, right at Valve's threshold, as well as DAC 2017, which was truly a non-Valve event, just over a $600,000 prize pool. Some of these events have been not so good. So WCA 2015 was a bit of a disaster, saw a lot of controversy in terms of teams not getting paid. WCA 2016 was maybe a little bit better, but it still had its problems. It again had a relatively very large prize pool, upwards of $500,000, but some issues. WESG, as I talked about before, in terms of the lucrativeness of the event, very, very large prize pool, 1.5 million total, but a little bit alternative format, not really viewed as that serious a tournament by most of the people that followed the Dota 2 professional scene. More importantly, though, this is something you don't necessarily just get from looking at the number of events and the prize pool structure. The schedule has just been absolutely insane. And this, more than any single reason, is probably why I'm glad we're getting this major system and a little bit more clarity about how the scene's going to look moving forward. There were 3 $100,000 or more LAN events between TI6 and Boston. Only one of those, MDL 2016, actually occurred between TI6 and the Boston major invites being announced. And this is where you got a little bit of craziness that, Execration, for example, although they ended up not being able to make it to Boston due to visas, was actually invited to the Boston major based upon MPGL, which was a much lower profile tournament, was mostly SEA regional with a couple of Chinese teams. And that really kind of, it set a lot of us for a little bit of a spin in terms of understanding the way that those direct invites were working. There were 7 $100,000 or more events between Boston and Kiev, so you started to see a little bit more events flowing into the scene. The Kiev major invites were much better informed. We had a lot more data, so there were 6 events in that approximately 4-month period. But then we got the total explosion this last month, and there were actually as many LAN events held over a 30-day period just before TI invites were announced as there were over a 4-month period before the Kiev major. So the imbalance in the schedule was becoming really crazy. I mean, it was a great month. Everybody had a lot of fun watching all this Dota, but a lot of us were beginning to express concerns about, hey, TI is great, but it felt like these 6 LANs from May to June were all sort of pre-qualifiers or earn your direct invites, and then you had the massive TI qualifiers, and then TI, what's happening the other 40 or 50 weeks of the year. So this was a big concern, and I think the announcement today was mostly a step trying to stabilize and even out the schedule, make sure that we have high quality Dota being played throughout the year. All right, let's talk specifically about which events since TI6 would have qualified or could have qualified to be quote unquote majors. All right, so WCA is the first example. This is one I mentioned, had that over $500,000 prize pool. It did have international representation, so 3 Chinese, 2 SEA, EU, America qualifiers, plus 1 wildcard team that was kind of invited, I don't want to say last minute, but it was a little bit random. And again, this is one point that I'll look at. Nothing says you have to have at least 1 qualifier from all 6 regions. Nothing says that you have to have an equal representation. So you can break, provided you meet that one qualifier minimum, you can break things down in terms of both direct invites versus qualifier slots and regional representation, however you want. And I'm actually hopeful that this will happen. Now, this tournament had its problems. TNC ended up qualifying but not competing due to an incomplete roster. Wings was replaced sort of at the last minute in this tournament. There were a bunch of stand-ins that were used. And this is one of the big sort of